Hey there, night wanderer. Welcome back, or welcome for the first time. Tonight's story is a journey through the cold stone corridors, smoky great halls, and dangerously uncomfortable lives of those who once lived inside medieval castles. We're diving deep into what it really felt like to eat, sleep, and survive inside those towering walls. Not the fantasy, but the frostbitten, flea-ridden reality. Now, think about your home today, your soft bed, your warm socks, your thermostat. Then imagine waking up on a pile of hay, surrounded by rats, your breath visible in the icy air, and your toilet is a hole in the wall dropping into the moat. We romanticize castles all the time, but life inside them? It was far from royal. So, before we begin and before you get too comfortable, hit that like button and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy the content I create. And tell me in the comments, what city and country are you watching from? And what time is it right now where you are? It's always amazing and genuinely humbling to see how many of you are joining in from all over the world. Seriously, thank you for being here. Now, let's begin. This is how medieval castles were disgusting, dangerous, and cold. Let's get something straight. Moving into a medieval castle wasn't like stepping into a fantasy novel. It was more like moving into a giant stone refrigerator built by someone who hated windows, warmth, and the concept of comfort. Sure, it looked impressive from the outside. Massive towers, thick stone walls, flags flapping dramatically in the wind. But inside? Well, inside, things got real bleak. Real fast. First, there was the cold. And we don't mean put on another blanket kind of cold. We're talking about a creeping, relentless chill that slithered through the walls, up your legs, and right into your soul. Stone doesn't hold heat. It stores cold like it's collecting it for winter, which, unfortunately, is winter. The fireplaces were meant to help, but most of the heat was swallowed by the vast, empty space and lost up the chimney. Unless you were sitting practically inside the fire, your toes were doomed. Then came the darkness. Light in a medieval castle was a luxury. The windows were nothing more than narrow slits, made to keep arrows out, not let sunlight in. So even at noon, your grand hall looked like it was lit for a séance. Torches sputtered with thick, oily smoke, casting shadows that danced on damp stone walls and made everything look just a little haunted. And let's not forget the smell. Castles had a signature aroma, a blend of wet rock, sweat, smoke, and the faint but ever-present perfume of whatever passed for a toilet. Spoiler, it wasn't good. Every gust of wind carried something new and unpleasant through the halls. Maybe the kitchen's burning dinner. Maybe the draft from the latrine. Maybe just the lingering memory of a knight who hadn't bathed since the last crusade. Walking through a castle meant crunching over rushes on the floor, pushing past tapestries that served more as insulation than decoration, and constantly wondering what that noise was in the corner. Was it a rat, a ghost, a very cold relative? No one really wanted to find out. So, if you were dreaming of courtly dances and cozy feasts by the fire, brace yourself, because castle life was more survival than celebration. And winter was the main character. At a distance, castles are magical. You see them rising out of the mist, tall, proud, eternal. Turrets stretching toward the sky, flags fluttering in the breeze. They look like something out of a fairy tale. You imagine royalty lounging in luxury, warm feasts by the hearth, and knights polishing their armor in sun-dappled courtyards. But here's the truth. Castles were cool only in the literal sense, because inside they were cold, miserable, and honestly kind of gross. These weren't glamorous fortresses of luxury. They were survival bunkers made of rock and regret. And once you stepped through those big wooden gates, the romance ended fast. It hit you with a chill in the bones, a damp in the air, and a smell that could only be described as medieval. Because castles weren't designed for people. They were designed to withstand sieges. Every feature was focused on defense. High walls, narrow windows, thick gates, winding stairs. If comfort showed up in the blueprints, it must have been immediately escorted out by a man in chainmail. The cold, relentless. The walls were made of stone, thick, heavy, and brutally efficient at absorbing any warmth your body dared to emit. Fires tried their best, but the heat rarely made it past the person sitting closest. Everyone else got to enjoy the ambiance of flickering shadows and visible breath. The atmosphere? Damp. The stone sweated. Moisture oozed from the walls. You didn't walk through castle halls, you sloshed. Mold and mildew had their own zip codes. Sometimes they grew faces and started attending dinner. And then there was the smell. It wasn't just the fire smoke or the food. It was the unique combination of people, livestock, chamber pots, rushes, and thyme. A smell that said, yes, humans live here, and we've made peace with that decision. Noise was another unexpected delight. Castles were echo chambers. One sneeze in the main hall, and it echoed through 6 rooms and probably scared the goat asleep in the kitchen. Every footstep bounced around like it was narrating your arrival. Whispers traveled faster than gossip. There was no privacy, only public cold. And let's not forget the pests. Rats, fleas, lice. Oh my. You weren't alone in your suffering. Entire micro-civilizations lived in the walls, the beds, the clothes. If you weren't itching, scratching, or suspicious of a sudden rustling noise, you probably weren't paying attention. Even the food didn't save the experience. Bread was hard enough to use as a weapon. Meat was either overcooked, undercooked, or just old. Water wasn't always safe, so people drank ale, yes, even the kids. Because apparently, lukewarm, slightly fermented barley water was the lesser evil. So yes, castles looked majestic from far away, in fog, at sunset. But the closer you got, the more you realized. This wasn't a place of legend. It was a medieval endurance test disguised as architecture. And the only people who truly liked living in castles were the ones who had never actually done it. Castles had walls for protection, but they didn't protect you. Not from the cold, not from the damp, and certainly not from the experience of stepping onto an icy floor at 3 a.m., because you needed to use a toilet that was literally a hole in the wall. Stone walls were strong, yes. They could withstand battering rams, sieges, and the occasional drunken night. But when it came to warmth and comfort, they were about as sympathetic as a tax collector with a toothache. The cold wasn't just ambient, it was aggressive. The walls weren't just cold to the touch, they actively seemed to generate cold. You could sit next to them in summer and still feel like you were leaning against disappointment made solid. Winter was worse. If you leaned on the wall too long, there was a genuine risk you'd freeze to it. And then, of course, there were the floors. Stone floors. No rugs, no insulation. Just flat, hard, frigid misery underfoot. You didn't walk on them barefoot unless you enjoyed voluntary frostbite. Even with shoes, if you could call them that, you still felt every ounce of chill rise up through your soles like a slow, creeping doom. Most medieval footwear wasn't exactly high performance. A bit of leather wrapped around your feet, maybe some cloth, maybe not. The idea of cozy slippers didn't exist. If your shoes kept your feet from bleeding on the walk to the privy, you were winning. To fight back against the freezing floors, people threw rushes on them, basically bundles of dried reeds and straw. They were supposed to insulate the ground. In practice, they acted like biodegradable floor mats. that slowly turned into compost. People rarely changed them, so over time, the rushes soaked up whatever fell on them: water, food, beer, bodily fluids. Eventually, they smelled like sadness and horse. If you were lucky or rich, you might have had an animal skin or two on the floor. These helped, but they also brought their own problems: fleas, bugs, and the lingering sense that the cow you were walking on might still be judging you. Even the noble families with their four-poster beds and fancy fireplaces weren't immune. Their rooms were just as cold, their toes just as frozen, their complaints slightly more elegant. So, while castles may have been designed to keep people out, they also did a fantastic job of keeping warmth out. Cold feet weren't just a seasonal issue. They were a full-time lifestyle. And stone didn't care who you were. It didn't bend. It didn't warm. It just sat there, quiet, heavy, and bitter. Let's say you've finally gotten a fire going. Your hands are warming up. And for just one glorious second, your nose isn't running. That's when it hits you. A blast of cold air so targeted, so ruthless, you'd think winter itself was personally offended by your comfort. That was a castle draft. In the hierarchy of castle problems, drafts were the silent assassins. Invisible, relentless, and absolutely everywhere. You couldn't see them, but you felt them. Especially when you weren't expecting them. You see, castles weren't built with insulation in mind. The walls were thick, sure, but they were stone. Stone stacked on stone with nothing between. No mortar seal, no weatherproofing, no medieval equivalent of caulking. Just cold, glorious gaps for air to squeeze through and chill your bones like a bad omen. The windows didn't help. Narrow slits called arrow loops were designed for defense, not ventilation or warmth. Even closed, they let in gusts of icy air that blew across your back like the breath of an angry snow spirit. Wind would whistle through corridors, dance around corners, and occasionally knock over things just to remind you who was in charge. People did their best to fight back. Tapestries were hung not for decoration, but to try and block some of the airflow. Bundles of moss and cloth were shoved into cracks. Shutters were slammed shut and covered with animal hides, oiled parchment, or, in desperate times, just a pile of chairs. Did it help? A little. But the drafts always found new paths. Like smug little air ninjas, they'd sneak through a hole in the roof, down through a crack in the wall, and straight under your blanket. They especially loved bedtime, because there's nothing more hilarious to a medieval draft than a human trying to be warm. Some folks even tried to sleep behind curtains or in alcoves, little built-in nooks where the wind couldn't find them. Except the wind always found them. You could be wrapped in 3 cloaks, 2 blankets, and a prayer, and still feel that faint icy kiss on your cheek at 2 a.m., and the sound. Oh, the sound. Drafts didn't just chill you. They haunted you. They howled. They moaned. They made shutters rattle and doors creak. At night, the castle felt alive. And not in a charming, magical way. In a something's watching me, and it might be the air kind of way. If you lived in a castle, drafts were just part of your daily suffering. Like taxes or oat porridge. You didn't beat them. You learned to layer, to huddle, and to hope. Because in a battle between you and moving air, the air always won. You wake up in a medieval castle and want to greet the day. Maybe pull open the curtains and let in a golden beam of sunlight. But there's just one problem. There are no curtains. There's barely even a window. What you have instead is a slit in the stone wall, narrow, vertical, and approximately big enough to stick one eye through. Medieval castles weren't built to admire the view. They were built to repel invaders. And when it came to light, fresh air, or general joy, well, those were secondary concerns. Windows, if you can call them that, were basically arrow loops. They were long, thin gaps designed to allow archers to fire out without letting enemy arrows back in. In theory, a bit of light would sneak through during the day. In practice, your sunlight was more like a faint glimmer of hope, and maybe the silhouette of a bird if it flew by at the right angle. Glass? Forget it. That stuff was rare, precious, and wildly expensive. If a lord was rich enough to afford real window glass, it was probably just one tiny pane in the main hall. The rest of the castle got treated to animal hide windows. Yes, actual stretched bladder or parchment that let in light while blocking, well, most of life. It was like looking at the world through the back of your soup. And during storms, those arrow slits turned into wind tunnels. Rain blew in, snow piled up. Birds occasionally wandered through. People nailed up wooden shutters to block the worst of it. But even then, the wind found its way in through every crack and crevice. The inside of your room often felt like the outside, with slightly more furniture. Darkness, meanwhile, was a full-time resident. Most castle interiors were in a state of perpetual twilight. Without windows, there was no sense of time. You couldn't tell morning from afternoon unless someone told you. Rooms stayed dim even at noon, and once the sun set, you relied entirely on candles and torches, assuming you could afford them. Candlelight was soft, romantic, and wildly inefficient. One candle didn't do much against a room full of shadows. Two just made it smokier. You weren't illuminating the space. You were setting the mood for medieval anxiety. Torches flickered, dripped wax, and gave off more smoke than light. Reading after dark? Not unless you were fine going blind before bedtime. The lack of windows did strange things to your head. It made everything feel heavier, slower. Time blurred. Emotions dulled. You weren't just in the dark, you were of the dark. In winter months, when daylight barely lasted, it was like living in a pocket of gloom that just refused to lift. So no, there were no sunny breakfast nooks in castles, no golden hour selfies from the battlements. Just dim, damp rooms lit by flickering flames and haunted by the ghost of natural light. You didn't wake up to birdsong. You woke up wondering whether it was morning or still last night. Welcome to castle life, where the sun shines somewhere else. If you were picturing a roaring hearth at the heart of a medieval castle, pumping out warmth like some kind of magical stone furnace, I've got some bad news for you. Medieval fireplaces didn't so much heat the room as they auditioned for the role of biggest disappointment of the century. And for most castle residents, the only thing they reliably produced was smoke, frustration, and a slightly increased risk of catching on fire. Fireplaces were a relatively new concept in early castles. Before them, you had central fire pits in the middle of the hall, with smoke drifting upward and hopefully out a hole in the ceiling. If it didn't, congratulations. You were now breathing like a smoked ham. Even once fireplaces were added into castle design, the results were mixed. Some had chimneys, some didn't. Some were stone-lined, some were just open spaces where people burned things and hoped the fire would aim its heat in their general direction. Spoiler, it usually didn't. You'd huddle as close to the fire as possible without singeing your eyebrows. Meanwhile, the rest of the room remained a frozen wasteland. There was no such thing as central heating. There wasn't even such thing as evenly distributed heating. Your front side might roast while your back froze, creating the classic medieval experience of being both overcooked and undercooked at the same time. And then there was the smoke. Because ventilation? Optional. Chimneys were often short, crude, or badly built. Smoke filled the upper levels of rooms, clinging to ceilings and turning every wall into a soot-smeared canvas of medieval suffering. You coughed, your eyes watered, your clothes smelled like bonfire leftovers. But hey, no fleas. That was the silver lining. Smoke made a decent bug repellent, and you'd need that when your bedding doubled as flea housing. Castles often had one or two fireplaces, but only in key rooms. The main hall, maybe the Lord's chamber. Everyone else? You either got the scraps of heat from a dying flame or no heat at all. Servants, kids, and guests huddled under cloaks or layered themselves in everything they owned. The only people who slept warm were the ones who fell asleep next to the fire, or directly in it, which occasionally happened. Keeping the fire going was a full-time job. Someone had to stoke it constantly, add wood, adjust the embers. Let it die in the middle of a January night, and you didn't just get cold, you got panic. Restarting it wasn't as simple as lighting a match. You needed flint, steel, tinder, and the fire-starting skill of a wizard. So yes, the fireplace was the heart of the castle. But it wasn't a cozy heart, it was smoky, fussy, inconsistent, and occasionally threatening. Basically, the medieval version of a housemaid who promises to help with chores and then sets the kitchen on fire. If you've ever gotten lost in your own house, congratulations. You're already halfway to understanding what it was like to live in a medieval castle. Because the floor plans were not made with logic in mind. They were made by someone who, presumably, had never seen a house and just started stacking stone wherever it felt emotionally satisfying. Medieval castles weren't designed by architects so much as they were assembled over generations by feuding noble families with differing opinions on what a useful hallway meant. First, you had a keep. Then you added a tower. Then someone got paranoid and built a wall around that tower. Then another lord added a storage room above the kitchen. Then a paranoid cousin added a murder hole above that. What you ended up with was less a building and more a medieval stone maze with delusions of grandeur. Room sizes varied wildly. One chamber might be big enough to host a feast, while the next was barely large enough to swing a sword, or use the toilet without hitting your elbow on 3 different walls. Ceilings were too low in some rooms, too high in others, and sometimes the stairs just ended. Literally. Like the stonemason went on break and never came back. Some staircases spiraled up so tightly that if you sneezed while climbing them, you'd fall down 3 floors. Others were built to curve clockwise so right-handed attackers had trouble swinging swords, which made perfect sense during battle, and 0 sense when Grandma tried to carry a tray of soup up to the guest room and nearly got yeeted into the Bailey. Doors didn't match. Some were tall and majestic, others were hobbit-sized and required a full crouch. Some opened one way, some the other, and a few were fake, blocked up or bricked over centuries ago but still left in place as a joke. The joke was on you. Heating? Random? If your room happened to be near the one functioning fireplace, lucky you. Everyone else had a decorative hearth that hadn't worked since the reign of King Who Knows. And if you had a window, it probably opened into the inner courtyard, where the kitchen smoke drifted in. Bon appetit. Storage was another mystery. Need a place for tools? Try the tower next to the chapel, past the goat room. Looking for linens? They're in the room above the armory, behind the second door on the left, unless the rats moved them. And forget privacy. Walls were thin or full of gaps. Servants wandered in and out constantly. Half the time, rooms were shared with extended family, guests, guards, or livestock. Yes, the same goat that watched you eat dinner might also watch you sleep. So yes, castles were full of rooms. But those rooms weren't designed for peace, comfort, or clarity. They were designed like a medieval fever dream of defense, chaos, and drafty corners. You didn't live in a castle. You navigated it, one creaking stair and misplaced door at a time. Ah, the chamber pot. The medieval answer to one of life's most basic questions. Where do I go when I've gotta go? Spoiler, the answer was a small, often unwashed bowl that sat quietly under your bed, waiting for the worst moments of your day. If you thought living in a castle meant elegant bathrooms and golden commodes, think again. This was a less royal flush and more personal bucket of doom. The chamber pot was standard issue for everyone from lowly servants to highborn nobles. They came in all shapes and materials: ceramic, metal, even wood if you really wanted to experience splinters in your shame. You used it when the weather was too foul to visit the privy outside, when it was the middle of the night, or when you just didn't feel like dealing with icy floors, howling winds, and stairs designed for athletic goats. The ritual went something like this: squat, pray for accuracy, and hope your aim was better than last time. Then, if you were considerate, or, more accurately, if someone else in the household made you, you'd dump the contents out a window, into a gutter, or, if you lived in a slightly more civilized castle, into a designated disposal chute. These chutes were known as garderobes, and we'll get to those soon. Trust me. Now, this sounds gross. That's because it was. Chamber pots weren't emptied every time. Sometimes they stayed under the bed until morning. Sometimes longer. And remember, this is before deodorant, before scented candles, before windows that opened wide enough to do anything useful. That smell? That was your roommate now. If you were wealthy, you might have a servant whose job was, wait for it, to empty your pot. That was their whole role, royal waste removal. If you were lucky, they did it often. If not, well, let's just say the air in the chamber started to feel thick. Sometimes chamber pots got mistaken. A guest might knock one over. A child might use it as a toy. A clumsy foot in the night might kick it into full catastrophe. The floor? Dirt or stone? The cleanup? Primitive? The consequences? Traumatizing. And let's not ignore the winter factor. Using a chamber pot in the middle of a freezing night was a full-body emotional experience. Every part of you screamed, "Why am I doing this?" while the freezing porcelain reminded you that comfort was for another century. Etiquette around chamber pots was loose at best. Some people used them behind curtains. Others had no shame. Privacy was a suggestion, not a rule. You might find yourself mid-conversation when someone across the room casually relieved themselves behind a decorative screen. If you were lucky, they bowed afterward. So, next time you think your bathroom is too small, or the water's a little chilly, remember? Medieval people went to the bathroom in a bowl they kept next to where they slept. Every single night. And if that doesn't make you hug your plumbing a little tighter tonight, nothing will. If the chamber pot was medieval indoor plumbing's desperate little brother, the privy was its older, louder, and significantly more terrifying cousin. Also known as the garderobe, this architectural innovation was essentially a fancy term for a poop hole built into the side of your home, with nothing between you and the outside world but gravity and hope. Privies were usually tucked away in castle walls, built high above the ground, often protruding slightly outward like a tiny stone balcony with an attitude. Underneath was, well, whatever was beneath. Sometimes a pit, sometimes the moat, sometimes just a sheer drop onto the rocks below, which sounds dramatic until you realize people actually fell out of these things. The concept was simple. A wooden seat with a hole in it, maybe a stone slab if you were lucky. You sat, you did your business, and down it went, into the abyss. Plumbing, non-existent, privacy, rare, dignity, long gone. Now, let's talk conditions. The privy was cold, always cold. The air blew up from below with the same energy as a dragon exhaling in reverse. In winter, sitting on the stone or wood was like pressing your backside against a frozen tombstone. And if the wind caught you just right, it was like being punished by nature for having bodily functions. They didn't always have doors either, just a curtain or sometimes nothing at all. You could be enjoying your moment of medieval relief only to make awkward eye contact with someone passing by on the wall walk. That kind of thing stays with you. Cleaning? No one was cleaning the privy. Waste would build up underneath, sometimes for years, until someone finally went down there to shovel it out. That someone was usually not paid nearly enough and probably questioned every life decision that had brought them to that moment. And yes, people fell in. Whether they slipped, lost balance, or just misjudged where the edge was, it happened. Falling into the latrine was a real medieval fear. People died that way. That's right. Imagine telling your ancestors that Great-Uncle Edmund perished not in battle, but in a tragic toilet-related accident. Some castles tried to improve the system by building chutes that carried waste further away, into cesspits or ditches. But the technology was crude, the smells were fierce, and the success rate was debatable. Sometimes those pipes backed up, froze over, or cracked, sending waste somewhere very unintended. And wiping? If you're wondering what they used, moss, straw, hay, rags, or even just their hands. There was no toilet paper, there was no soap, there was only faith and regret. Still, the privy was considered an upgrade from the chamber pot. At least your waste left the room. But standing there, pants around your ankles, wind howling through the wall, with your backside suspended over a 30-foot drop, you probably weren't feeling very advanced. Let's set the scene. You walk into the great hall of a medieval castle, the stone echoing with the sounds of boots, armor, and distant grumbling. A noble stands proudly by the hearth. Rich velvet cloak, jeweled belt, golden circlet, power, prestige, and a smell that could knock over a fully armored knight at 10 paces. Because for all their status, medieval nobles didn't smell like rosewater and royalty. They smelled like medieval people, which is to say sweat, smoke, mildew, meat grease, livestock, and an ever-present whiff of "I haven't bathed in weeks, and my cloak has absorbed the soul of a goat." Hygiene in castles was complicated. Water was hard to get, especially hot water. Bathing involved boiling massive cauldrons, hauling them into drafty stone rooms, and trying not to catch a chill while stripping down in a place with no real doors. So nobles bathed rarely. Some once a week, some once a month. Some only on special occasions like feast days or near-death experiences. To compensate, they layered on fragrances. Not perfume as we know it, but strong herbs and scented oils. Lavender, rosemary, sage, mint. Stuffed into pouches, rubbed into hair, or pinned under the armpits. If you were lucky, you smelled like a spiced cupboard. If not, you smelled like desperation at a Renaissance fair. Clothes weren't washed often either. Washing fine fabrics was risky. They could fade, shrink, or tear. So instead, nobles aired their clothes out. Let that sink in. If something started to smell, you didn't clean it. You hung it in the breeze and hoped the wind would carry your sins away. Of course, that only worked so well. Cloaks reeked of smoke from fireplaces. Linens absorbed everything from sweat to wine, to whatever unfortunate snack was dropped during last week's feast. Boots? Let's just say they were made for walking, through filth, and they brought souvenirs back to the Great Hall every time. Then there were the rushes on the floor. Remember those? Supposed to keep things tidy, but in practice they trapped every scent that passed through. Old food, chamber pot accidents, damp straw, wet dogs. A medieval noble could throw a feast, dance the night away, and still go to bed smelling like someone had barbecued onions on their laundry pile. And the castle itself didn't help. Ventilation was bad, really bad. Smoke from hearths mingled with the scent of food, sweat, candle wax, livestock, and rot. The result was less pleasant aroma and more historical assault on the senses. The only real break came from open windows, and those let in the wind and all the smells from the moat, which was not better. Guests and diplomats got used to it. You didn't comment. Everyone stank. It was a great equalizer, and if you ever asked a noble about it, they'd probably reply with a confused expression and an herb pouch shoved politely into your face. So, yes, the nobility lived richly, but they smelled like survival, like salted meat and old velvet, like ambition marinated in mildew. And frankly, that's exactly what medieval power smelled like. You've been trudging around in layers of wool, sweating under fur cloaks, sleeping beside goats, and feasting on mutton and mead for days. So naturally, you'd think a nice bath would be in order. Well, medieval you would laugh. Because in a castle, bathing wasn't a daily ritual. It was more of a seasonal miracle. Let's start with logistics. Running water? Not a thing. Heated water? A luxury bordering on science fiction. If you wanted a bath, you had to haul in cold water from a well or stream, lug it up the stairs in sloshing buckets, and heat it over a smoky, sputtering fire that would take hours to boil even one pot. Then you poured it into a wooden tub, cracked, maybe moldy, and hoped the wind didn't blow out the fire halfway through. Once filled, that bathwater didn't stay warm for long. You were in a drafty stone room, possibly with a view of the snow-covered courtyard through a poorly sealed arrow slit. Taking off your clothes was less liberating and more a race against hypothermia. And here's the kicker, you weren't even guaranteed your own bathwater. Families often shared. Dad went first, then Mom, then the kids, then Grandma. By the end, the water was less soothing soak and more lukewarm people soup. And if you were a servant, congratulations. You were probably just wiping down with a damp rag near the hearth, if that. So how often did people actually bathe? That depended. Some nobles made an effort during feast seasons, marriages, or major holidays. But for most, a few times a year was plenty. If you lived through winter without freezing, you considered yourself clean enough by divine mercy. Instead of washing regularly, people relied on the ancient art of covering up the problem. This included linen underclothes to absorb the bad stuff, scented herbs stuffed into garments, and yes, simply deciding not to care. Dirt, after all, was seen as protective. A nice layer of grime meant you were sealed against the wind, like a very smelly winter coat. Hair, mostly unwashed, greased with animal fat to keep it slicked down. Beards were rarely trimmed, and lice combs were more common than soap. If you had access to vinegar, you might rinse with that now and then. Or wine, if you were fancy. But most of the time, your head smelled like whatever you'd slept in. And soap? It existed, but was expensive and often reserved for laundering clothes or preparing for church. Or death. Whichever came first. Despite all this, medieval folks did value cleanliness, just not the way we think of it. They cleaned their hands before meals, They wiped faces with cloths. They swept rushes from the floor, eventually. But a full-body bath, that was an event, like a wedding, or an eclipse. So next time you stand in a steamy shower with soap in one hand and conditioner in the other, take a moment to appreciate the marvel of it. Because in a castle, bathing was less self-care and more frosty gamble with slippery consequences. You didn't come out refreshed. You came out shivering, damp, and wondering if the goat had used the tub first. If you lived in a medieval castle, your skin wasn't glowing. It was struggling. Constant exposure to cold, smoke, rough fabrics, and questionable bathing habits meant that almost everyone was walking around with at least one weird rash, a persistent itch, or a colony of microscopic roommates. Let's start with the obvious. Lice, head lice, body lice, and their even more charming cousins, fleas, were part of the medieval lifestyle. You didn't get rid of them. You lived with them, combed them, named them, wrote sad poetry about them in the winter. Lice combs were so common, they were practically a fashion accessory. In noble households, a servant might be tasked with delousing the lord's head while he plotted invasions. Now, that's multitasking. And fleas? Oh, they loved the rushes on the floor, the straw in your bedding, the folds of your cloak. They'd bounce from person to person during a feast like they were networking at a royal banquet. Every noble gathering was a buffet, just not the kind you were thinking of. Scabies, eczema, and fungal infections ran rampant. Moisture trapped under too many woolen layers led to red, raw patches that never fully healed. Scratching was a medieval sport. You didn't get strange looks if you were doing it. You got strange looks if you weren't. Then came boils, zores, and the dreaded skin rot. Blame it on the lack of clean water, or the fact that most clothes were never washed. A small cut could turn into an infected, festering mess in days. Pus was not a rare sight. Neither were people wearing bandages that hadn't been changed since last harvest. Some folks believed these conditions were caused by bad humors or divine punishment. Others thought garlic, ash, or a good leeching would help. If all else failed, you were prescribed a balm made of goose fat, herbs, or something dug out of a bog. Rashes weren't just itchy. They were shared. Families lived packed together, often sleeping in the same bed, wrapped in the same blanket, sharing the same set of bacteria and skin problems. If one person came down with something flaky, odds were the rest of the family would be scratching within the week. Even nobles, with their fine clothing and private chambers, suffered. Fancy cloaks didn't breathe. Velvet itched. Silk chafed. And since they bathed even less frequently than peasants, their royal skin often needed more prayers than pampering. And still, they made it work. They developed a high tolerance for discomfort. They wore linen underclothes to soak up sweat and keep outer layers clean. They used vinegar or wine to wipe down problem areas. They patted on powdered herbs to absorb oil. It wasn't glamorous, but it was survival. So the next time you put on moisturizer, exfoliate, or enjoy the luxurious act of washing your face with water that didn't come from a questionable moat, thank your skin. And thank your century, because back then, if you had clear skin, you were either incredibly lucky or already a ghost. You might think the kitchen was the warmest, most inviting room in the castle. After all, that's where the food was, the hearth, the stew pot, the freshly baked bread, right? Wrong. The medieval castle kitchen was the kingdom's most chaotic arena, part smokehouse, part burn hazard, part rat sanctuary, and entirely too dangerous to be romantic. First, the fire. Always burning, always angry. Medieval kitchens had open flames the size of dragon mouths, roaring beneath blackened cauldrons and massive spits, turning hunks of meat that looked more like battlefield trophies. The hearth smoked constantly, puffing out thick, greasy air that clung to the walls, the cooks, and the unfortunate souls passing by. Ventilation? Don't be ridiculous. Windows were small and sealed, so the smoke just hung in the air like it paid rent. Everyone's eyes watered, everyone coughed. Some kitchens had chimneys, but they were temperamental. The only thing worse than too much smoke was a flue collapse, because then your dinner was ruined and your eyebrows were gone. Second, the heat. The fires made the kitchen boiling in summer and bearable in winter, but always unpredictable. The temperature fluctuated depending on how many fires were lit, whether the wind was blowing the wrong way, or if a duck exploded. Yes, that happened. Animal fat and fire don't mix well. And then came the food. Meat was hung from ceiling beams, often half-cured, half-questionable. Bread was sometimes burned outside and raw in the middle. Pies could contain anything from mutton to pigeon to mystery filling. Vegetables were boiled until they resembled grief. Spices were rare unless the Lord was rich, in which case they were used to mask the taste of meat that had been aging like a forgotten shoe. Well-seasoned in the medieval kitchen meant we tried to hide the rot. The kitchen staff, heroes in their own right. Cooks worked like blacksmiths, shouting, sweating, dodging fire. Servants carried dripping pots up and down steep stairs, always one stumble away from disaster. And all of this while rats scurried between flour sacks, dogs begged underfoot, and the occasional goose wandered in to cause poultry-based chaos. Cleanliness was situational. Washing dishes happened in cold water, often shared with laundry. Cutting boards? What cutting boards? Meat got chopped on tabletops, stumps, or the floor. Cross-contamination wasn't even a concept yet. Food fell, was picked back up, and served with a shrug. Despite all this, the kitchen worked. Meals happened, feasts were thrown. Pies arrived at tables, and somehow not everyone died. So when you think of castle life, just remember, behind every noble feast was a smoky inferno, where someone was screaming. Something was burning, and at least one goose was definitely in the wrong place. In a medieval castle, dinner wasn't just a meal, it was a gamble. A full plate might mean survival, or it might mean food poisoning, mysterious illness, or the kind of stomachache that had monks writing your will. Let's just say, when you sat down to eat, you weren't just hungry, you were brave. The biggest culprit? Meat. Castles loved their meat, beef, pork, venison, pigeon, peacock, even swan if they were feeling fancy. But storing it? That was tricky. There were no fridges, no ice boxes, no Tupperware. Meat was salted, dried, or hung in cold pantries where it slowly turned from edible to iffy to definitely possessed. Even preserved meat had issues. Salted beef could be so tough you needed a dagger to cut it and strong teeth to survive it. And if the salting was done poorly, or someone got lazy, your noble roast might come with a side of parasites or botulism. Bon appetit. Fish was also a castle staple, especially on religious days when meat was forbidden. But unless you lived right by a river, fish had to be carted in from the coast. And unless it was salted and dried within an inch of its life, it arrived smelling less like the ocean and more like a cautionary tale. Then there were the dairy products. Milk spoiled fast. Cheese went moldy. Butter could turn rancid. Sometimes that was intentional. Aged cheese, they called it. But let's be honest. Medieval aging methods mostly involved letting something sit in a warm room until it either became a delicacy or declared itself sentient. Even bread wasn't always safe. In hard times, millers cut flour with whatever they had, ground up beans, acorns, or dust. If the grain was damp, it might grow ergot, a toxic fungus that caused hallucinations, convulsions, and, in some villages, full-blown mass hysteria. All from a loaf of bread. Magic mushrooms? No, just murder rye. Water, too, was suspect. Wells could be contaminated. Rivers were often open sewage lines, so people drank ale instead, everybody, including kids. Ale was safer, but it wasn't light and crisp. It was thick, warm, barely fermented, and tasted like barley's last cry for help. Add to that the overall kitchen hygiene situation, unwashed hands, shared knives, meat chopped on wood darkened by decades of use, and you start to see why meals were often followed by silence, prayers, and sometimes funerals. Food testing existed, kind of. Tasters were assigned in noble households, usually low-ranking servants who had the honor of sampling suspicious stews before the Lord did. If they didn't collapse within the hour, the meal was declared probably fine. And yet, people ate. Because what choice did they have? And to be fair, not all food was deadly. Some was hearty, filling, even delicious. Especially with fresh ingredients, careful prep, and a little luck. But in the wrong conditions, your feast could turn into your final course. If castles had a mascot, it wasn't a lion or a noble eagle, it was the rat. Sneaky, fast, and completely unavoidable, rats were the real rulers of the realm. They didn't ask for permission, they didn't pay rent, and they were everywhere. They lived in the walls, in the floors, under the straw rushes, behind barrels in the kitchen, and sometimes directly in the pantry where the dried meat was supposedly hidden from pests. Jokes on the meat. It was basically an open invitation. Rats weren't just present. They were bold. They'd skitter across your feet in the great hall, pop out of the fireplace mid-dinner, and help themselves to bread during morning prayers. Some were fat, well-fed survivors who had clearly figured out the system. Others were lean, aggressive, and completely uninterested in your screaming. Castles were perfect for them. Warm cracks in the stone, endless food scraps, spilled ale, forgotten corners. There were no rat traps, no poison. Cats existed, yes, but even they got tired of the fight. Some castle cats simply accepted their new rodent roommates, or worse, formed some kind of unholy truce. Rats chewed through sacks of grain, nibbled on stored food, and sometimes even climbed up into beds. You'd wake up to a tiny face peeking out from under your blanket like, "Oh, sorry, didn't see you there." And of course, with rats came disease. Fleas hitched a ride on rats like tiny medieval Uber passengers, spreading illnesses from castle to countryside. The most infamous, of course, being the Black Death, a plague that traveled with rats across Europe like a very deadly tour bus. Even nobles weren't spared. Their halls might be grander, their walls thicker, but rats didn't care about wealth. They followed the food, and the trash, and the warmth. A noble's chamber was just another place to scurry, squeak, and nest. Servants were often tasked with chasing rats away, using brooms, boots, or the occasional crossbow, though that sometimes caused more property damage than rodent casualties. If a rat died in the wall, you didn't remove it. You just dealt with the smell for a few weeks and pretended it was incense. There were folk remedies, burning sage, sprinkling ash, hanging dried herbs from the beams. Some worked, most didn't. Rats stayed. Because they could. Because they knew. So, when you picture a grand medieval castle, full of torches, banners, and armored guards, don't forget the real kings. The whiskered ones, the relentless ones, the ones who survived everything history threw at them and still ruled the pantry by midnight. Living in a medieval castle wasn't just cold, dark, and unsanitary. It was actively hazardous to your health. Every hallway, staircase, and decorative rug was one wrong move away from being your final memory. Because while castles were built to keep enemies out, they often didn't extend that same courtesy to the people living inside. Let's start with the obvious. Stairs. Castle staircases were steep, narrow, and spiral. Not just for aesthetics, these curves were meant to confuse attackers, but they also confused everyone else. They turned tightly to the right so that right-handed invaders would be at a disadvantage. Great idea in theory. Terrible if you were just trying to carry a loaf of bread to Aunt Matilda's chamber without breaking your neck. There were no railings, no landings, just cold stone, questionable lighting, and the ever-present chance of a sudden trip into oblivion. And if you slipped, you didn't land on carpet. You landed on more stone, or someone else who had slipped before you. Even doors were dangerous. Some swung out, some in, some were hidden, others opened to nowhere. There are actual records of doors that led straight off walls because an upper floor had collapsed and no one had gotten around to removing the entrance. Mind the Gap had real consequences. Tapestries? Pretty and warm, but also excellent for hiding cracks, gaps, or entire holes in the wall. More than one unlucky visitor leaned against a decorated section expecting support, only to tumble sideways into architectural betrayal. Then there were loose stones. Castle walls settled over time. Floors shifted. Stone steps wore down unevenly. 1 foot too far in the wrong direction, and suddenly you were testing the limits of medieval ankle durability. Ceilings dripped. Sometimes water, sometimes worse. The beams above were often blackened with smoke, or weakened by years of woodworms. Add a bit of damp from the leaky roof, and you had a medieval surprise waiting to crash down onto your stew. Speaking of stew, kitchens were mini war zones of open flames, sharp tools, boiling liquids, and slippery floors. You were more likely to burn yourself making dinner than defending the keep. Furniture wasn't much better. Stools tipped, benches cracked, and beds were raised high to keep out pests, but that also meant falling out of one was an event, especially if you had no chamber pot and tried to fumble down in the dark, half asleep. Oh, and don't forget trapdoors and murder holes. Some castles had genuine booby traps. Secret passages, pivoting floor stones, or hidden drop shafts designed for defense but rarely labeled for household use. One wrong step, and it was less fetch more wine and more disappear forever. So, yes, castles were sturdy. They were intimidating, but they weren't safe. Every creak, every shadowed corner, every questionable plank was a reminder. Survival wasn't just about war or winter. It was about navigating your own home without becoming a cautionary tale. Ah, the moat. That iconic ring of water that circles the castle, sparkling in storybooks, teeming with crocodiles and fairy tales, and somehow always filled with mystery. In reality, it was less magical defense mechanism and more open toilet with a better view. Moats were initially practical. They created a barrier between the castle and invaders, making it hard for anyone to march up and knock on the gate with a battering ram. But not every castle had crystal-clear water surrounding it. In fact, none of them did. Most moats were filled with stagnant water, sludge, weeds, and, depending on where you lived, everything from waste to the occasional farm animal that wandered in and never wandered back out. These weren't filtered ponds or koi gardens. They were ditches, big muddy ditches that stank. Because here's a secret, moats doubled as medieval plumbing. Human waste, animal droppings, kitchen runoff. It all got dumped out castle chutes and pipes. And guess where that waste went? That's right, into the moat. The term waste management was medieval code for chuck it into the water and walk away. During hot months, moats became fermentation ponds. Imagine sun-baked sewage mixed with rotting food and the occasional dead thing. The smell? Unforgettable. Which might explain why everyone inside the castle looked so serious. You couldn't bathe in it, you couldn't drink from it. And if you fell into it, the only thing you were soaking in was shame and disease. And yet people did fall in. Sometimes by accident. Sometimes on purpose, escaping during sieges or sneaking in at night. If you were lucky, you made it across. If not, well, at least the smell warned people where you went. Moats were also breeding grounds for bugs. Mosquitoes swarmed the banks. Frogs croaked constantly. Rats loved the muddy edges. It was less a military feature and more of a swampy welcome mat for pestilence. In winter, they froze over just enough to be dangerous. A child might walk across and fall through the thin ice. In summer, they dried out to reveal the discarded contents of castle life. Bones, boots, the occasional rusty helmet, and, yes, more than one full chamber pot. So, next time you admire a romantic drawing of a castle reflected in its surrounding moat, remember that water wasn't shimmering. It was steaming. The moat didn't protect the castle from the world. It held the castle's worst secrets. Like a moat-sized reminder that medieval luxury had some very smelly limits. So, you're living in a castle. You've survived the freezing bedrooms, the bad meat, and the rats that moonlight as landlords. But there's one more danger lurking in the shadows. A threat so medieval, so humiliating, it's hard to believe it's real. Yet, here it is. People fell into castle toilets, and they didn't always come back. You may remember the garderobe from earlier chapters. Those quaint little stone closets built high on castle walls with a direct drop to whatever unlucky surface lay below. A hole in a bench, no seat, no railing, no light. Just stone, gravity, and hope. Using the garderobe was already a risk. You'd walk down a narrow hallway, often in the middle of the night, possibly half asleep or shivering from the cold. You opened a low wooden door, crouched carefully over a hole, and tried not to think about the pit beneath you. That pit might be a cesspool, it might be a moat, or it might be a 40-foot drop into your own personal doom. Now imagine slipping. No modern handrails, no safety bars. Sometimes not even a latch on the door. Add slippery floors, cold stone, or a good gust of wind, and you had the perfect setup for what we'll generously call a full-body hygiene emergency. There are actual recorded cases of people falling into their own toilets. Nobles, clergy, servants, no one was immune. In some rare cases, they survived. In most, they didn't. Because you didn't just fall into a hole. You fell into a toxic pit of human waste, possibly broke a limb on the way down, and then drowned in something that should never be water. And if you didn't fall all the way in, you could still fall partially. There's nothing like dangling above a cesspit in the dead of night, screaming for help while your dignity slowly drains away with your socks. If the garderobe wasn't terrifying enough, there were multi-level latrine stacks, essentially vertical shafts that serviced multiple floors. One hole above another, and another below that. One wrong move, and you weren't just a bathroom casualty. You were someone else's worst surprise. Engineers tried to make improvements. Some garderobes were lined with stone to keep things contained. Some had wooden seats added later, but these were rare luxuries. Most castle toilets remained dark, precarious little chambers of shame. The psychological impact? Deep. People feared the privy. Children were warned not to go alone. Servants sometimes refused to clean the chutes. Even the bravest knight might hesitate before entering the latrine tower on a stormy night. So, next time you visit a medieval castle and see that innocent little closet built into the wall, just remember, it may have been the most dangerous seat in the house. When you think medieval lord, you probably imagine him slumbering on a grand four-poster bed, wrapped in furs, beside a crackling fire, maybe dreaming of jousts and roasted boar. But the reality, it was more freezer with hay than luxury suite. Beds in castles weren't made for comfort. They were made for not dying. If you were lucky, you had a wooden frame. If not, it was just straw stuffed into a sack on the stone floor. Either way, it wasn't winning any sleep awards. Let's talk materials. The average mattress was filled with straw, hay, or reeds. Sometimes moss, sometimes whatever they had lying around. Over time, it compacted, grew moldy, and made strange rustling noises that may or may not have been insects. And if you didn't regularly change the straw, which many didn't, you weren't sleeping on a bed. You were sleeping on a low-budget ecosystem. Sheets were rare. Blankets were scratchy wool, often shared. Pillows? Possibly a rolled-up cloak or your arm. The idea of a pillow-top mattress would have been sorcery. And the cold. Oh, the cold. Castle rooms were drafty. Stone walls sucked warmth out of the air like they had a grudge. Fireplaces didn't reach the corners of the room. So, people layered. And I mean layered. You wore what you owned. Multiple tunics. Socks made from stitched wool. Cloaks over cloaks. You didn't go to bed to relax. You went to bed to survive. Nobles sometimes had curtains around their beds, not for drama, but for insulation. They created a pocket of slightly warmer air. Without those, sleeping was like camping in a meat locker. And the pests, bedbugs, lice, fleas, your nightly companions. You scratched, you swatted. You learned to live with it. If you were really unlucky, a mouse might join you for warmth. Or a rat, or a cat chasing that rat. Servants didn't have beds, they had corners. Or the kitchen hearth. Or shared a pile of straw with 3 siblings and a goose. Privacy? Non-existent. Comfort? Legendary only in how little there was. Even noble sleep routines were weird. People often woke in the middle of the night, a natural break between first sleep and second sleep, to stir the fire, say prayers, or visit the chamber pot. If you didn't fall back asleep, tough luck. There was no counting sheep. They were probably already in your bed. So the next time someone says, "He slept like a king," you might want to ask, which century? Because in a medieval castle, sleeping like a lord meant being cold, itchy, and praying the straw didn't poke you in places too delicate to describe. If you thought bedtime was a private, peaceful experience in a medieval castle, think again. There was nothing quiet, elegant, or solitary about sleeping in the Middle Ages. In fact, a more accurate description would be medieval human lasagna. Layered bodies, shared blankets, and the vague hope that nobody rolled over too aggressively. Because in a castle, heat was rare and precious. Fires went out, walls leaked cold, and insulation was a rumor started by desperate peasants. So what did people do to keep warm at night? They piled in, families slept together, servants slept in the same rooms as nobles, guests squeezed into corners, children wedged themselves between parents, siblings, and pets. Privacy was a modern luxury. Back then, the more bodies, the more warmth. That was the rule. People slept fully clothed, often in layers of wool and linen, wrapped in cloaks with boots still on. Why take them off when the floor could freeze your toes off before sunrise? If you were lucky, you had a bed. If not, you curled up on a shared straw mattress, slowly flattening into a human pancake by morning. There was a strategy to the arrangement. Elders and babies got the middle, prime warmth territory. Stronger adults formed the outer shell, shielding the group from drafts, critters, and the general existential horror of nighttime in a castle. It wasn't comfortable, it wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Then there were the noises: snoring, grumbling, coughing, the occasional dream mumble. Add in the sounds of livestock in the hall, wind moaning through the walls, and your cousin whispering gossip in his sleep, and you had a medieval lullaby you'd never forget. Bedding was basic. 1 blanket for 5 people, maybe 2. Pillows were cloaks. If someone moved too much, they were exiled to the edge, the dreaded cold zone, also known as the draft corridor. That side of the bed didn't just feel colder, it felt betrayed. And yes, sometimes animals joined in. Dogs, cats, even the occasional goat, especially in winter. Their body heat was welcome. Their smells? Tolerated. Their decision to stretch out across your legs at 3 a.m.? Regretted. Sleeping this way wasn't just practical, it was social. Families bonded, stories were told, songs were sung, farts were ignored, kind of. But mostly, it was about not freezing to death, which took precedence over manners. So, while group sleeping might sound cozy, remember, it was scratchy, crowded, and smelled like turnips and unwashed socks. You didn't sleep deeply, you hibernated, like a nervous squirrel trapped in a haystack full of relatives. If you've ever strolled through a castle and admired the grand tapestries, those massive woven scenes of hunts, battles, or religious devotion, you probably thought, wow, such elegant medieval artwork. But the truth, they weren't hanging there for art appreciation. They were there to plug the holes. Literally. Tapestries weren't for style. They were for survival. Behind every grand woven wall covering was probably a draft large enough to extinguish candles and whisper unspeakable cold across your ankles. The castle wall itself? Stone, thick, yes, but filled with tiny gaps, cracks, and the subtle hum of wind plotting your demise. So medieval folks got creative. They hung fabric, big, heavy, itchy, woven blankets of wool and linen. These weren't gentle wall accents. These were full-blown thermal shields designed to trap warm air, stop breezes, and make rooms feel slightly less like ancient refrigerators. The fancier the home, the bigger the tapestry. Nobles used them to show off. Look, a battle scene. Also, please ignore the crumbling wall behind it. Sometimes they were dyed with bright colors or embroidered with gold thread. But make no mistake, their primary purpose was not dying of frostbite while you ate dinner. Some tapestries weren't even images, just solid color blocks of wool, draped over the wall like a medieval winter coat for your house. Others were recycled from old clothes, rugs, or even animal skins sewn together by desperate servants with frozen fingers. They were hung in great halls, bedchambers, chapels, and anywhere else the wind liked to sneak in. In some cases, the tapestry was the only thing between your sleeping face and the raw chill of outside air pushing its way in through the wall seam. Over time, these wall hangings absorbed everything: smoke, grease, food smells, and whatever else the room had to offer. They rarely got cleaned. A tapestry might be beautiful, but it probably smelled like a smoked turkey that got into a fight with a candle. And when fire wasn't roaring, tapestries were crucial. The warmth they held in was the difference between hosting a feast and having your guests quietly freeze to death while politely sipping barley soup. Did people admire them? Sure. But mostly, they hugged the walls during storms. whispering a quiet thank you to the itchy wool heroes keeping their teeth from chattering. So the next time you see a grand medieval tapestry, don't think of it as museum-worthy art. Think of it as a giant, unwashed scarf protecting a cold, ancient wall from turning your nose into an icicle. You might imagine nighttime in a castle as peaceful. A fire flickering, maybe a lute playing softly, and the gentle silence of a sleeping fortress. But that's not how it worked. Night in a medieval castle was a full-on auditory assault, a sensory chaos festival where the cold bit, the wind screamed, and you tried not to have a mental breakdown before morning. Let's start with the cold. By sundown, fires had burned down to coals. The hearth's glow reached only a few feet before giving up entirely. Beyond that, cold shadows. You wrapped yourself in cloaks, huddled under stiff blankets, and accepted that at least one part of your body would be frozen until April. Then came the wind. Castles were built on hills or cliffs, great for defense, terrible for warmth. The wind howled through the tiniest cracks, slapping shutters, rattling doors, and making your tapestry sway like they were trying to escape. A perfectly timed gust could snuff out your candle and your will to live. And speaking of candles, once they were out, things got dark. Not cozy dark. Not, maybe I'll watch the stars, dark. Number? This was, I can't see my own feet dark. Your eyes never fully adjusted. Shadows danced in the corners. Every creak of wood, every groan of stone, every footstep that might be a rat, made you question everything. And let's not forget the animals. Livestock often slept indoors in winter. Cows near the kitchen, goats in the hall, chickens wherever they pleased. If you've never been woken at 2 a.m. by a rooster walking across your pillow, you haven't lived a full medieval life. And that's assuming the humans were still, but they weren't. People shifted, turned, argued about who stole the blanket. Someone always had to pee. And using the chamber pot in the dark while stepping over your entire extended family. That was a stealth mission worthy of knighthood. Above you, the rafters groaned. The roof let in drips. Somewhere, a dog barked. Somewhere else, someone whispered, "Did you hear that?" And suddenly, everyone was awake again. Night wasn't rest, it was survival. Cold pressed in like a weight. Time slowed to a crawl. You weren't asleep, you were paused, waiting for dawn, hoping no one fell into the garderobe on the way to the toilet. Again, most people think of cold coming from the air, but in a castle. Cold came from below. It seeped up from the very stones, climbed through your boots, and whispered, "Nice feet, shame if they turned blue." Castle floors were mostly stone or packed dirt. They were tough, yes, but also freezing. In winter, walking barefoot was like strolling across misery itself. Even with shoes, thin leather soles, wrapped cloth, maybe fur if you were lucky. Every step was a reminder that warmth was just a rumor you once heard at a feast. And it wasn't just discomfort. The floor was actively hostile. Sitting too close to it gave you numb legs. Sleeping directly on it was a form of torture reserved for the uninvited and the unlucky. It was said that if your straw mattress flattened too much, you'd start to feel the earth itself judging you. Rushes were one attempted solution. These were bundles of dried reeds scattered across the floor for cushioning and cleanliness. Except they got wet, molded quickly, and trapped everything from fleas to soup. Eventually, they became little more than cold, damp mulch that crunched underfoot and smelled like a swamp made of regret. Even the fancier chambers weren't spared. You could have velvet curtains, gold leaf furniture, and a four-poster bed. But your toes were still hovering an inch above frostbite unless someone brought you hot stones, or a small dog. The poor had it worse. They slept on bare earth. In lean winters, the floor might actually freeze. People would wake up with hair frosted and breath visible, all while lying in what used to be a kitchen corner. Add in the occasional draft or leak from above, and it was basically sleeping inside a medieval fridge. Some castles tried floor solutions, straw mats, woven rugs, wooden planks, but these were temporary, expensive, and often didn't help. One noble's plan to warm the floor with heated tiles ended with cracked stones and an unintentional smokehouse effect. And yes, disease loved cold feet. Many believed chills brought illness, and honestly, they weren't wrong. Cold floors meant poor circulation, aching joints, and a long winter full of suspicious coughing. That's why people layered. Thick socks, 2 pairs if possible, layers of cloth underfoot. They slept with boots on, they tucked their cloaks beneath them. Anything to stay 1 toe ahead of the frost. So, if you ever picture yourself lounging in a grand medieval hall with a goblet in hand and fur boots on your feet, just remember, the floor is cold. Always cold, and it's coming for your ankles. Let's talk about lighting, or, more accurately, the barely there flicker of hope that passed for lighting in a medieval castle. When night fell, castles didn't glow with lanterns and chandeliers. They sank into a kind of half-darkness, where every shadow looked suspicious and even your own cloak hanging on the wall could briefly terrify you. The most common source of light? Candles. But not the lovely, sweet-scented ones you find in modern spas. No, these were tallow candles, made from animal fat, smoky, slow-burning, and emitting a smell best described as burning livestock with a hint of sadness. They dripped wax like waterfalls, sputtered in drafts, and sometimes went out entirely just because they felt like it. And they weren't cheap. A candle was a luxury item, something to be rationed carefully, not casually lit for ambiance. Some nobles used beeswax candles, which were brighter, cleaner, and smelled slightly less awful. But those were pricey, often imported or saved for important occasions like royal visits, feast days, or the rare moment someone wanted to see their own dinner clearly. Otherwise, you made do. Torches lit the bigger rooms. Oil lamps were rare, temperamental, and just as likely to catch a curtain on fire as illuminate a stairwell. And here's the kicker. You had to carry your light with you. Need to go to another room. That candle came with you, which meant you had one hand holding it, one hand not tripping over something, and 0 hands for fending off rats, clutching a chamber pot, or defending your honor. Servants often went first with lights, guiding nobles through dark halls like medieval flashlights who also got blamed if someone stubbed their toe. And you'd better hope the wind didn't blow out the flame halfway through your journey, because then you were walking blind, trying to remember which side of the hallway had the murder hole and which had the wall. Speaking of which, darkness wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. The line between castle corridor and unexpected drop was often blurry. One misstep in the dark and you could find yourself tumbling downstairs, stepping into cold water, or opening a door into the night sky. There were no light switches, no emergency lanterns. If your candle went out, your best option was to stand still and yell until someone brought another, or until morning. So while candlelight may seem romantic, in medieval castles it was survival. You loved your candle. You feared losing it. And you learned to live with your nose constantly twitching from the scent of beef-flavored wax slowly melting in your only source of hope. Castles were impressive feats of architecture. Tall towers, thick walls, drawbridges, but let's not pretend they were designed with comfort or basic safety in mind. In fact, Some castle features felt less like defense mechanisms and more like traps for the people who lived there. Let's start with spiral staircases. These were built narrow and tight, almost claustrophobically so, and they almost always spiraled clockwise. This gave defenders coming down the stairs more room to swing their right-handed swords, while attackers coming up had the central post in their way. Smart design, right? Absolutely. Until you try climbing them while carrying a bucket of water, a tray of hot stew, or your half-asleep toddler. There were no railings, just worn, uneven steps slick with centuries of foot traffic and maybe goat poop. And if you slipped, you fell hard, possibly all the way down. Then there were murder holes, small gaps in ceilings above gateways or hallways where defenders could drop stones, arrows, boiling water, or, most famously, boiling oil on invaders. Brutal, yes, but also a serious hazard during peacetime. One wrong turn, one clumsy servant, and the murder hole became more of a whoopsie hole. Arrow slits looked cool, but were terrible to walk past on a windy day. Blasts of cold air shot through them like nature's way of reminding you this castle didn't care about your comfort. And the roofs, flat, open spaces meant for defending the walls, were full of trip hazards, loose stones, crumbling battlements, and the occasional abandoned tool. Walking up there in the dark, like asking to be launched off the parapet by accident. Then there were the hidden passages, great for escaping sieges, bad when someone forgot they existed and fell into one. Trapdoors led to storage rooms or lower chambers, or to actual traps. Sometimes they were left open or warped just enough that stepping on them caused you to fall into a pit used for storing who knows what. Surprise! Castles also had ladder access lofts with no guardrails, loose flagstones, and rusty iron spikes just sticking out of random walls like historical reminders of tetanus. Even the portcullis, the heavy metal gate at the entrance, was known to crush more than one horse or unlucky guard during a mistimed closing. In short, castles weren't just built to keep the enemy out. They were unintentionally built to take out the residents, too. Every step was a challenge. Every hallway a test of memory. Every creak and corner a whispered dare. Do you feel lucky, peasant? So, you've been invited to a castle. Congratulations. You're either important, desperate, or too stubborn to say no. You pack your finest tunic, maybe a sack of apples, and head off expecting noble hospitality. What you get instead? A drafty corner, an itchy blanket, and a chamber pot that's seen things it can never unsee. Let's be clear. Being a guest in a castle wasn't glamorous. There were no guest suites, no embroidered welcome pillows, no soap. What you got was floor space, maybe a bench, and instructions like, "Don't touch that tapestry, it's hiding the hole." Beds were scarce. They were reserved for the lord, his family, and maybe a high-ranking visitor. Everyone else? You slept where you could, on the floor, on a pile of straw. Or, if you were lucky, a shared mattress that had already welcomed 3 other guests and a dog. You were expected to bring your own bedding. Seriously. A traveler's bundle often included a cloak to sleep under, some linen to use as sheets, and a flat sack of straw to call a mattress. No bundle. Enjoy sleeping in your boots and praying you don't wake up with someone's elbow in your ear. And you definitely needed to bring your own chamber pot, especially if you weren't staying near the privy. Borrowing one? Bad etiquette. Using someone else's by accident. A social crisis. Some guests kept theirs tucked under their straw pile like a medieval security blanket. Others braved the hallway at night, risking a collision with servants, rats, or worse. A guard who hadn't had breakfast yet. Meals were a mixed bag. If the Lord liked you, you got a seat at the table. If not, you stood along the wall and hoped someone passed you bread. No assigned seating, no menu, and definitely no allergy accommodation. If you didn't like what was served, your options were go hungry or fight the dog for scraps. Entertainment varied. Sometimes you listened to a bard. Sometimes you watched two cousins argue over inheritance rights. Other times, you were the entertainment, recounting your travels while everyone judged your clothes and secretly wondered if you brought lice. And don't even think about overstaying your welcome. A few days was fine. A week, risky, 2 weeks. You were officially a burden. People started making subtle comments like, "Isn't the harvest coming soon in your region?" Or, "I think your horse is starting to miss you." Being a guest was survival with etiquette. You smiled, nodded, accepted the cold, and left before the chamber pot overflowed. Because in a castle, hospitality didn't mean comfort. It meant, we didn't stab you, you're welcome. Castles didn't just house lords and ladies. They housed an entire unofficial kingdom of uninvited guests with tails, wings, and glowing eyes in the dark. First up, rats. We've covered them before, but it bears repeating. These weren't the shy little creatures of fairy tales. These were bold, well-fed rodents who lived like kings in the walls, floors, and pantries. They chewed through sacks of grain, dragged bits of meat behind barrels, and occasionally gave you a surprise visit during dinner. Then came the bats. Castles had plenty of dark, hidden spaces, towers, rafters, unused chimneys, perfect for colonies of squeaky, winged squatters. At night, they'd flutter overhead, occasionally dive-bombing your candle, or skimming the stew pot like tiny leathery goblins. Most people didn't even flinch anymore. They just said, "It's just a bat," and continued eating. Now, for the most complex housemates, cats. You'd think cats would be helpful. You'd be mostly right. They were great for catching rats if they were in the mood. But cats were also chaotic neutral. They wandered into feasts. They slept in noble beds without permission. They walked across important documents and then barfed on them. Some castles revered their cats, fed them, named them, even gave them little collars. Others treated them like staff. Expected to work, rarely appreciated. And let's be real, cats didn't care either way. Dogs, too, lived in castles, especially near kitchens. Big ones for guarding, small ones for catching vermin. But they all had the same idea: sleep near the fire and steal food when no one's looking. And then there were the weirder creatures. Owls nesting in towers, squirrels finding their way into storerooms, and the occasional snake in the thatch roof. Medieval castles were ecosystems, and the animals didn't ask for permission. They simply showed up, stayed for dinner, and left when it suited them. Sleeping? You did it with a rat in the rafters, a cat on your chest, and the occasional bat flapping somewhere overhead. You got used to the squeaks. You stopped questioning the scratching noises. And if something furry brushed your foot at night, you prayed it was on your side. Because in the grand hierarchy of castle residents, the nobles ruled by day. But the animals ran the night shift. Think layering up is a modern trick for staying warm? Medieval castle residents were the original champions of wearable insulation, and somehow they still managed to be cold all the time. It all started with the undergarments. Linen, if you were lucky. This layer helped absorb sweat and was one of the few pieces you might actually wash. On top of that came wool, lots of it. Wool tunic, wool leggings, wool cloak, wool hood. You weren't dressing. You were wrapping yourself in a personal barn. Add in socks, sometimes 2 pairs, and shoes stuffed with cloth or fur. Gloves, mittens, arm warmers, leg wraps. The result? A medieval person preparing for a mild winter looked like a small walking haystack with poor visibility. Still, the cold got in. Wool is warm, but drafty rooms, icy floors, and constant wind laughed in the face of your fifth tunic. People slept in their clothes. All of them. You didn't get undressed for bed. You added layers. Only nobles had night clothes, and even they sometimes just slept fully dressed out of sheer stubbornness. The outer cloak was everything. It was your blanket, your coat, your fashion statement, and sometimes your only shield against wind that crept into bed and whispered, "Nice try." Some folks rubbed grease or animal fat on their exposed skin to seal in warmth. Others carried hot stones or embers wrapped in cloth to preheat their boots or bedding. Medieval life was innovation through sheer desperation. But no matter how many layers you wore, it was never quite enough. You were always a little cold, a little itchy, a little stiff. Movement was awkward. Falling down took longer. Getting up? Possibly a group project, and fashion? Out the window, you wore what worked. If it fit, you wore it. If it didn't, you still wore it. Medieval winter style wasn't about looking good. It was about not turning into a human icicle by breakfast. So while layering was essential, it was rarely effective. Because when you live in a stone castle with no insulation, the wind always finds you. Imagine this. You are wearing 5 layers of wool. It's been 3 weeks since your last bath, and your socks can now stand up on their own. You'd think the logical next step would be laundry, but in a medieval castle, washing your clothes was almost as rare as washing yourself, maybe even riskier. Why? Because laundry was an event, a physically exhausting, all-day team sport that often required fire, boiling water, soap, if you had it, and the willingness to carry heavy wet fabric that weighed more than your last meal. And since water sources were usually outside the castle walls, streams, rivers, or wells, you had to go out into the cold just to begin. Once you got there, you scrubbed the clothes on stones, you pounded them, you boiled them in huge cauldrons over smoky fires until they lost their will to resist. You stirred the pot like a stew, only instead of carrots, it was leggings, tunics, and an aggressive amount of fleas. The soap? Rare and expensive, often homemade from lye and animal fat. It worked, but it also could peel skin if you weren't careful. Your laundry might come out clean, or just a little crispier than when it went in. Then came the drying process. You couldn't just toss things in a dryer. You had to hang them in the wind, over bushes, or near the hearth. But castle air was damp. Fires were smoky. And if a sudden storm blew through, you were back to square one, with extra mud. So, most people chose the easier route, not washing clothes at all. Instead, they embraced the art of airing out. Clothes were hung by windows or near doors to pretend to be fresh. You might dust them off, shake out the bugs, and then layer on more herbs and hope. Some claimed that the dirt acted as insulation. Others just accepted it as part of life. Linen underclothes absorbed sweat and were washed occasionally, maybe. But wool outer layers? Those were like medieval denim. The more worn in, the better, and smellier. In summer, laundry was slightly easier. In winter, the water froze, your fingers froze, and the clothes froze mid-wring. You might end up with a shirt so stiff it could stand guard at the castle gate. So next time you complain about folding clothes, just remember, medieval folks preferred to marinate in their wardrobe. It wasn't laziness, it was logistics, survival, and a strong sense of olfactory denial. If you thought modern chores were tough, Try doing them with water that could double as weaponized ice. Because in a medieval castle, water wasn't just inconvenient. It was aggressively cold, and it hated your hands. Getting water started with fetching it. Unless you lived in a rare castle with an indoor well, this meant trekking to the courtyard, nearby stream or rain barrel, sometimes multiple times a day, carrying wooden buckets that leaked, splashed, or froze in your arms. Sloshing up stone stairs while trying not to spill a drop was a medieval obstacle course no one volunteered for. In winter, those water sources froze solid. You had to break the ice with an axe, then pray the bucket didn't crack in protest. Your hands? Red, raw, numb. Gloves didn't help when soaked. And the pain of dipping your hands into that freezing water for washing dishes, floors, clothes, or yourself, that was the Middle Ages slapping you directly across the knuckles. Even cooking became a cold battle. Hauling water for stew meant boiling it over a hearth that barely stayed lit. Washing vegetables, or whatever you called those roots you found in the snow, involved dunking them into the same icy water and pretending they were clean when your fingers gave out. Baths? Forget it. You boiled water in batches, poured it into a tub, and tried to get in before it lost its heat. By the time the tub was a half full, you were already too cold to enjoy it. Drinking water had to be stored in barrels or clay jugs, but even that had its problems. Water could freeze inside the jug. The barrel's spigot might freeze shut. And if the jug cracked in the cold, too bad. You were now in a committed relationship with lukewarm ale. Hands were hit the hardest. Castle life meant no warm sinks, no mittens thick enough, and no gentle hand soap. The cold left your fingers chapped, stiff, and sometimes bleeding. But you kept going, because there were no breaks for frozen hands, only chores. Some people rubbed lard or tallow on their hands to seal in warmth. Others just blew on them constantly like wheezing bagpipes. Fires helped, but only if you could get close. And most fireplaces were occupied by people, animals, or regret. So the next time your faucet runs a bit too cold, remember, medieval folks were washing dishes in water that could give you frostbite before it got your plate clean. Everyone deserves a moment of peace, a break, a little time to themselves. But in a medieval castle, even that sacred human experience, the bathroom break, was a trial by cold, fear, and public embarrassment. We've talked about the garderobe, the castle's hanging toilet chamber. But let's be honest, it was less bathroom and more emergency stone closet with a hole and a grudge. And if you think you could use it in peace, think again. The location alone was problematic. Garderobes were built into exterior walls, ideal for dropping waste into the moat, terrible for warmth. Wind howled through the chute like it was trying to file a complaint with your kidneys. Sitting down wasn't relaxing. It was an act of courage. And then there were the noises. The moaning wind, the creaking wood, the distant splash, the occasional echo of someone else doing their business 2 floors below. Some garderobes were communal, just a row of holes, no dividers, and a gentle reminder that privacy was for nobility, not your backside. Using the privy during a storm, worse. The wind blew through so fiercely you risked losing your cloak. Rain could blow upward. Lightning flashed through the gaps. You weren't just using the toilet, you were starring in a medieval horror show. Now, imagine a siege. With enemy archers outside, waste piling up inside, and your only option being to use a hole facing outward over a 30-foot drop, you'd start asking serious questions about life choices. And of course, accidents happened. Slips, falls, dropped items. One wrong move and your dagger, or your dignity, was gone forever. Servants were tasked with cleaning waste chutes, sometimes with buckets, sometimes with long sticks, and always with a deep sense of existential dread. There were even rules about who could go when. Noble families had schedules. Servants waited their turn. And if a guest used the Lord's garderobe without permission, social exile, possibly execution by side-eye. So no, there was no peace in the privy, only a moment of terrifying exposure, suspicious breezes, and the quiet hope that this time, maybe, you'd leave with your cloak, your dignity, and your balance intact. Castles may have looked solid, regal, and fortress-like from the outside, but inside they were riddled with secrets. Not the fun, whispered in the corridor kind. No, these were the trapdoor, collapsing wall, accidentally fall to your doom kind. Because medieval castles weren't just built for living. They were built for surviving, spying, and sometimes assassinating. Let's begin with secret passages. Many castles had them, hidden staircases, narrow tunnels carved into walls, trapdoors behind tapestries. They were used to sneak out during sieges, to move between rooms unseen, or, let's be honest, to avoid awkward dinner guests. But they came with a price. No lighting, no labels, no guarantees. Many, a curious servant or drunk noble, wandered into a shadowy doorway and never came out the other side. Some fell down shafts. Others hit dead ends and got lost. One wrong step, and you could drop through a rotten floorboard into a wine cellar that hadn't been opened since the plague. False doors were another hazard. Built to confuse intruders, they led to nowhere. Blank walls, empty shafts, or sudden staircases that stopped mid-air like the architect got distracted halfway through. Then there were murder holes. Yes, the name is literal. These were small openings above doors or narrow hallways used to drop boiling liquids, rocks, or arrows on unwanted guests. Effective in battle. Horrifying during a midnight bathroom trip. Wall slits looked like decorative gaps, but sometimes they connected to chambers where guards or spies could watch and listen. You could be mid-conversation about who's stealing the good cheese, unaware that someone 2 feet away was silently taking notes, or just waiting to sneeze. Let's not forget the dungeons. Many were below ground, dark, damp, and often built with no official map. Some were accessible only through hidden doors, making them the medieval equivalent of an oops, I lost another cousin situation. People fell into these rooms. Some were locked in and forgotten. And of course there were legends. Secret rooms filled with treasure. Hallways that changed length. A window that only opened during a full moon. Whether real or not, the castle's design made these stories feel eerily possible. The worst part? Many of these features were added without anyone telling the next generation. So by the time the 5th Baron inherited the castle, he had no idea that the charming alcove in the Great Hall was actually a death chute used in a border dispute. So yes, castles had secrets, deadly ones, some still waiting to be discovered. But the biggest secret? That anyone survived long enough to pass them down. If summer was harsh, winter in a medieval castle was cruel and personal. It didn't just sneak in, it moved in, unpacked its frosty bags, and stayed far past its welcome. Castles weren't built for coziness. They were built to withstand sieges and terrify enemies, not keep your toes warm. And once winter arrived, it was game over for comfort. Drafts poured through arrow slits, snow drifted into corridors, and fires did their best. But their best wasn't enough. Stone walls didn't just hold cold, they projected it. You could walk past a wall and feel your breath freeze. Floors were colder than betrayal. Blankets were never enough. Even the goats complained. The kitchen hearth became the most coveted spot in the castle. People didn't gather around it, they fought for it. Entire social hierarchies formed based on who got to sit closest. The lowest rank, the one standing behind the goose. And when the fire died, panic set in. Reigniting a flame in the dead of night meant fumbling with flint, steel, and prayers. Meanwhile, the cold crept in like a villain with excellent timing. Supplies ran low. Bread turned stale. Ale froze in the barrels. Rats became bolder. After all, they were cold too. And if your boots froze overnight, tough luck. You wore frozen boots or no boots. Food was rationed. Root vegetables, dried meat, and whatever moldy cheese hadn't walked off on its own yet. Meals got quieter. People started talking to themselves, or the fireplace, or the bread. And then came the sickness. Colds turned into infections. Coughs became symphonies. There were no antibiotics, just elderberry syrup, wishful thinking, and a very nervous doctor with a leech bucket. To cope, families huddled together, layers of clothing, layers of bodies. Privacy vanished. Personal space? A myth. Entire households shared beds just to keep from turning into human popsicles. And still, winter lingered. Days grew short. Walls grew icicles. The hope of spring felt more like a rumor. But they endured. They always did. Through cold breath, stiff fingers, and never-ending darkness. Because in the medieval world, winter wasn't just a season, it was a test. And passing it meant waking up with all your fingers still attached. In most homes, the kitchen is the heart of the house. In a medieval castle, it was the heart, and also a potential fireball waiting to happen. Castle kitchens were busy, smoky, chaotic spaces filled with open flames, dry wood, hanging meat, and servants moving fast with no OSHA in sight. A single spark could leap from the hearth to a straw mat, a wool cloak, or someone's greasy apron. And then you weren't roasting a duck. You were roasting the hall. Fires were always burning. Cookpots hung above open hearths. Spits turned constantly. Sometimes entire sides of beef were hung so close to the fire they dripped fat like a medieval horror show. And if that fat hit the flames, boom, instant flare-up. Bonus points if someone was walking past with a tray of bread. The kitchens were often located in separate wings or towers, for a reason. If they caught fire, at least the whole castle wouldn't go up in smoke. In theory, but wind, flammable walls, and chaotic storage made it easy for a kitchen fire to spread like gossip after a feast. And the tools, metal skewers, knives, pokers, all hot, sharp, and lying in places that guaranteed someone would grab the wrong end. Burns were a daily occurrence. So were arguments over who left the cauldron too close to the dog. There were no fire extinguishers, just water buckets, maybe sand, and a lot of yelling. Fire drills? Not unless someone shouted, "Fire!" and everyone ran in different directions, usually toward the fire, with more flammable things, and when the kitchen wasn't threatening to burn itself down, it was threatening to poison everyone. Food storage was dodgy. Cleaning was optional. Rats and flies were permanent residents. If the stew wasn't bubbling, it was probably growing legs. Yet somehow it worked. Meals were cooked. Feasts were held. Guests were fed. But every cook knew the real miracle wasn't the roasted meat or the warm bread. It was that the castle was still standing after dinner. Life in a medieval castle was full of threats. War, weather, rats, goat-related mishaps. But the most consistent danger? Disease. Invisible, relentless, and surprisingly creative. Illness didn't knock. It barged in, made itself at home, and invited its friends. Let's start with the obvious. Plague. The Black Death gets all the attention, and deservedly so. It wiped out a third of Europe, but there were plenty of other contenders. Dysentery, typhoid, influenza, and something ominously called the bloody flux were just as eager to ruin your week. Coughing? Start your prayers. The cause? Pick one. Rotten food, spoiled meat, foul water, unwashed bodies, or just sharing your bedroom with 10 people and a curious goat. Castles were breeding grounds for bacteria before anyone knew what a microbe was. If your cough didn't kill you, the cure might. Doctors of the day were creative. Medicine was based on balancing your body's humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Feeling feverish? Must be too much blood. Let's drain some. Sick to your stomach? Maybe a good purging will help. That's right. Half of medieval medicine was basically, let's empty you out and see what happens. Then there were the leeches. Bloodletting was the Swiss Army knife of medieval health care. Headache? Leech? Fever? Leech? Existential dread? Probably more leeches. And if leeches weren't handy, a nice sharp knife to open a vein would do. Herbal remedies were common too. Some were helpful. Garlic, honey, mint. Others were more questionable. Burned toad, powdered mummy, yes, actual mummies, and potions involving mold, moss, and the tears of whoever had to drink them. People also turned to superstition. Illness might be caused by sin, demons, or walking past the wrong person on a Tuesday. Protective charms were worn. Holy relics were kissed. Candles were lit. In some cases, churches doubled as hospitals, meaning you might convalesce next to a choir rehearsal. And let's not forget quarantine. If sickness spread, whole sections of the castle might be sealed off. Servants avoided rooms. Visitors weren't allowed in. The sick were moved to outbuildings, if they were lucky. If not, they stayed right where they were, coughing in the corner while everyone pretended not to hear. The truth? Most people didn't know what made them sick, and even fewer knew how to stop it. You lived with a cough for months. You prayed through a fever, and if you survived, congratulations. You were now immune to exactly that one disease. In a castle, death came in with the wind, the food, the water, or the handshake. It didn't wear a mask. It wore a smile and smelled faintly of soup. You know things are bad when you hear the word siege. It meant someone outside wanted in, and someone inside was not opening the door. And so began the quietest, slowest, hungriest standoff in history. A siege wasn't a battle. It was a waiting game. Attackers camped outside the castle walls, cutting off food, water, and hope. Inside? Panic, rationing, and whispered arguments about whether that stale cheese was still technically edible. At first, life continued. Fires burned, guards patrolled, cooks tried to stretch supplies. But as days turned into weeks, reality crept in like a draft. The gates stayed closed, the markets stopped, and every creak of the drawbridge sounded like hunger knocking. Food ran out fast. Nobles dipped into their pantries. Servants portioned bread. Salted meat vanished. Porridge became a main course. Then it was boiled weeds, suspicious broth, and eventually, rats. Yes, people ate rats, and sometimes shoe leather. And if things got bad enough, other things, but let's not go there. Water became a gamble. Wells could be poisoned. Rain was caught in barrels. Beer was safer, but there was only so much of it. Cups were rationed. Thirst became the background music to every conversation. Inside the walls, tension built. Guards got snappy. Nobles got paranoid. Servants whispered. Fires burned low. Silence fell, heavy and miserable. Children were kept quiet. Doors were bolted. The castle grew colder and darker, and all the while the enemy outside sang songs, taunted, or just waited, knowing that starvation was their sharpest weapon. Every bite of food became sacred. Every noise outside made hearts race, and as winter loomed or worsened, the walls began to feel less like protection and more like a stone coffin. Still, people endured. Some prayed, some plotted, some kept diaries. Others chewed boiled roots and pretended they were eating swan. And when relief came, either through victory, escape, or surrender, it wasn't joy they felt first. It was exhaustion. They emerged, blinking into the sun, lighter, quieter, and deeply, deeply sick of porridge. Castles didn't just smell bad because of chamber pots and livestock. Oh no, the kitchen contributed its own spectral scent trail, because once a feast was done, its ghost lingered. Not in memory, but in the air, the floor, the walls, and probably your cloak. After a meal, no one swept. No one wiped tables. Leftovers sat. Bones were scattered, breadcrumbs nestled into rushes. Cheese melted into flagstones. The fire sputtered out and the stew stuck to the cauldron like a grimy barnacle. Over time, the smell of old food became part of the decor. The dining hall reeked of smoke, grease, spilled ale, and meat that had ambitions of becoming soup, but died a slow, sour death. The rushes on the floor. That was a museum of meals past. Bits of onion from last Tuesday. A bit of goose fat from 2 feasts ago. Half a walnut from a guest who swore he'd bring his own snacks. The floor crunched and squished depending on where you stepped. And it wasn't just unpleasant. It attracted every pest in a 5-mile radius. Rats, flies, beetles, cats, and the occasional confused chicken all came to nibble on your dinner's remains. You couldn't even blame them. They were probably following the smell from the next county. Washing wasn't a thing. Plates were wood or pewter, cups were shared, fingers were the main utensil. Napkins? You had a sleeve? Maybe. The result? A sticky, greasy banquet scene that could be smelled from the roof. The stench built over time. Especially in winter when the cold preserved the worst parts. It was like being haunted by mutton and fish in equal measure. And when guests returned weeks later, they could tell what you served just by sniffing the air. Ah, yes, roast duck with thyme and mold. So next time you light a scented candle after dinner, spare a thought for those medieval folks. They didn't just remember last week's meal, they lived with it. For a brief moment in medieval castle life, everything sparkled. The fires blazed. The wine flowed. Someone was singing. Someone else was already dancing too hard. And a pig roasted slowly in the hall like a warm, meaty promise of better days. Feasts, festivals, and celebrations were the high points of castle living. They cut through the gloom like a well-placed torch. Weddings, saint days, solstices, harvest festivals, and the occasional "we survived another winter banquet" brought people together to eat, drink, and pretend they weren't freezing the other 364 days of the year. Tables were lined with food. Game birds, pies, breads, root vegetables, maybe even fruit if someone had recently committed a miracle. Ale and mead flowed like water, partly because actual water wasn't trustworthy, and songs filled the smoky rafters. There were jesters, jugglers, music, and poorly lit dancing that often ended with someone twisting an ankle in their boots. Lords gave speeches. Guests cheered. Bread was tossed to children and dogs. For one glorious night you almost forgot the rats, the coughs, and the suspicious stain growing on your bed straw. But then the cold returned. The fires burned out. The laughter faded. The guests left, or passed out on the rushes. And the hall, once alive with heat and cheer, turned into a cold stone tomb with leftover bones. The next morning, there were no servants singing. Only groans, spilled ale, and half a goose leg that somehow ended up in the firewood pile. The warm feast turned into cold reality. And that reality was you still lived in a medieval castle. The food was gone, the heat was gone, and now you had to clean. Someone had to scrape the meat grease off the floor, chase the dogs out of the pantry, and apologize to the goat that had wandered into the Lord's bedchamber during the dancing. Leftovers froze overnight. Someone spilled broth in the sleeping corner. Someone else used your cloak as a napkin. And someone, probably that one knight who never bathes, was still snoring beside the fireplace like he'd claimed it via conquest. By afternoon, the castle felt even colder than before the feast. The walls seemed grayer, the air sharper, the rats bolder. Even the cat looked disappointed. Because in medieval castles, celebration was a pause, a brief, bright spark before reality set back in, stone, smoke, and frost. The feast was fun, but the cold, it never left the party. It was just waiting for everyone else to go home. Castles weren't just homes for nobles, knights, and livestock. They were five-star resorts for every crawling, skittering, buzzing creature known to man, and quite a few no one could identify. Let's start with the fleas. They were everywhere. In your bedding, your clothes, your beard, your goat's beard. You didn't avoid them. You shared your life with them. Everyone scratched. It was less an inconvenience and more a medieval bonding ritual. Then there were the mites. Tiny, invisible skin gremlins that lived in your pillows, in the seams of your tunic, and probably in your soul. No one had a name for them, but they made sure you never stopped itching, especially during church. And then came the weevils. These little beetles loved grain stores. They infested bread flour, oats, even salted meat. And no one threw the food away. You just cooked the bugs with the stew. Extra crunch, extra protein, you're welcome. Flies swarmed the kitchens. Mosquitoes took over in summer, turning your sleepless nights into musical performances you never wanted. And spiders? They were almost respected for catching the other bugs. But then they got bold and started weaving webs in your goblet. The castle had no pest control, no sprays, no traps, unless you count your dinner. The best hope was a cat, who might chase mice if it wasn't too cold. Otherwise, people waved rags, set fires, or just ignored the problem until it bit them in the nose. Even nobles weren't spared. Their fur-lined cloaks were luxury condos for fleas. Their bedding was full of mites. Their wine occasionally had a floater. Being rich just meant you had more layers for the bugs to burrow through. None of it really worked, because the bugs didn't care. They lived there now, and they weren't moving out just because someone waved a bundle of sage in their direction. So, in a medieval castle, you didn't ask, "How do I get rid of these pests?" You asked, "How long until they're full and leave me alone?" When you think of a dungeon, you probably imagine a dark, damp room beneath the castle. Chains on the wall, maybe a skeleton or two. But the truth is, in a medieval castle, almost every room felt like a dungeon. You didn't need shackles. You just needed stone, darkness, and despair. Let's start with the basics. Light was rare. Most rooms were lit by a single flickering candle, maybe a torch stuck into a cracked wall bracket. Shadows loomed in corners. Ceilings disappeared in darkness. Half the time you weren't sure if you were alone or if someone was silently judging you from the tapestry. Furniture didn't help. It was sparse, uncomfortable, and always slightly off-kilter. Chairs creaked, benches tipped, the beds were lumpy, the mattresses thin, and the blankets full of questionable history. Moisture was a constant guest. Drips from the ceiling, dampness on the walls. Sometimes mold made faces. People just nodded at it. "Morning, Gerald," they'd say to the green stain above the hearth. Smells were layered: smoke, old stew, sweat, wet dog, goat, even when no goat was present. No amount of incense could overpower it. You just adapted. A sound, amplified. A whisper echoed like a secret confession. A sneeze became a war horn. Rats made more noise than some bards. Privacy? People walked in and out constantly. Servants, siblings, goats. A room might technically belong to a noble, but functionally, it was just a hallway with furniture. Even the decorations were depressing. Religious icons staring silently. Wall hangings that tried and failed to block drafts. Antlers mounted like grim warnings. And if you were sick, injured, alone, that room, no matter how grand, felt like a cell. Cold, isolated, timeless. So yes, castles had real dungeons, but honestly, every room had the energy of one, and the only difference was whether the door locked from the outside. Romance, moonlight, whispers in the corridor, a stolen glance over a goblet of mead. Except, wait, no. This is a medieval castle, remember? Romance wasn't hearts and flowers. It was more like frostbite and fleas. Let's set the scene. You're bundled in 5 layers of scratchy wool. Your nose is red from cold, and your chamber smells faintly of goat. You're trying to impress someone, but your breath fogs the air every time you speak. If you manage to lean in for a kiss without your teeth chattering, that's already heroic. And forget privacy. Servants were everywhere. Walls were thin. People slept in groups. There was no such thing as alone time. Even the garderobe had a draft, a waiting list, and probably a listening goat outside the door. If you did find a moment alone, the logistics were challenging. Blankets were heavy. Cloaks got in the way. Cold stone floors weren't helping anyone feel romantic. And just as you got comfortable, someone knocked, barged in, or tripped over a chamber pot with an apologetic, "Didn't know you were in here." Noble marriages were usually arranged. Romance, when it happened, often came after marriage, or very sneakily outside of it. Courting involved poetry, flower tokens, and sometimes sneaking love notes past 5 layers of servants trained in gossip. Love letters were a thing, but parchment was expensive. Sometimes people just carved initials into furniture, or composed awkward lute songs that made everyone wish for winter silence again. And what about love in the cold season? You didn't flirt with a noble's daughter. You flirted with the only warm spot in the room and hoped she was sitting next to it. "You look lovely in this lighting," often meant, "Your shadow is blocking the wind, please stay." So yes, castle romance existed, but it wore socks to bed, huddled near the fire, and whispered sweet nothings like, "Is that your foot or the dog's?" Medieval castles looked sturdy. Massive stone walls, towers that scraped the sky, gates of iron and oak. But underneath the swagger was a constant truth. Things fell apart, and fast. The castle could be attacked, yes, but it didn't need an army to collapse. It just needed time, fire, illness, or a slightly overcooked kitchen fire. Roofs leaked, walls cracked, staircases crumbled. Even drawbridges broke. And repairs? Good luck. You needed laborers, tools, and money. And most lords would rather spend that on wine, feasts, or another war. The church, however, offered divine protection. People prayed for their castles like they prayed for their crops and their goats. They blessed stones. They sprinkled holy water on doors. They carved saints into beams to ward off rot, ghosts, and possibly the in-laws. When disasters struck, like plagues, famines, or political scandals, everyone turned to divine intervention. Why did the tower collapse? Because we forgot to tithe. Why is the moat frozen in summer? Because someone insulted the bishop. Faith was as much a structural element as mortar. A priest blessed your new tower. A monk advised on window placement. A nun warned you not to sleep facing west. No one questioned it. You weren't just building a castle. You were trying not to get cursed while doing it. When lightning struck a chapel, people didn't blame architecture. They blamed someone's soul. And when repairs failed again and again, they prayed harder. God save the castle wasn't just a motto. It was the only plan. People love castles. They paint them. They visit them. They get married in front of them. But do you know what they don't do? Live in them. Because once you know what castle life was really like, you understand why the only smart move is visiting for a few hours, then running back to your heated, indoor plumbing-having home. Winter was a punishment. Summer was an infestation. Every shadow made noise, and every ceiling dripped. You couldn't bathe regularly. You couldn't clean properly. You didn't eat fresh vegetables. Your clothes stood up on their own, and you regularly dodged rats, servants, and collapsing staircases just to get to your cold dinner. Romance was a team sport. Privacy didn't exist. And nothing, not even bread, was safe from mold. So yes, castles are beautiful to look at, but no one's itching to move in. Because the reality wasn't magic. It was mud, smoke, noise, and a whole lot of sneezing. We miss the idea of castles. Not the actual castles, and that's okay. Let's leave the medieval fantasy where it belongs, behind a velvet rope and under modern lighting. And now, after flickering torches, shivering nights, smelly feasts, and one too many chamber pots, we've reached the end of our medieval journey. Castles were magnificent. They were terrifying. They were drafty, noisy, filthy, and occasionally glorious. They were the beating, crumbling hearts of medieval life. Equal parts fortress and freezer, dream and disaster. If you've stayed with us this far, you've walked the cold stone halls. You've heard the screams of the wind through the slits. You've coughed in the smoke, scratched at the fleas, and marveled at the sheer stubbornness of people who lived this way and called it home. Tonight, you sleep with warm blankets, with walls that don't breathe cold, with no goats pacing near your pillow. Take a breath, be still. You've survived the Middle Ages, at least in spirit. So, from the fireless hearths, the flea-filled beds, and the gloriously uncomfortable stone halls of history, we say good night. You've earned your rest. May your dreams be filled with castles, only with better insulation.